So they're not looking at this interior evidence that we're looking at. They're not looking at all those things, missing elements. They're not looking at how early the Gospels are cited by Paul. They're not looking at about how early the first students of the eyewitnesses began to repeat the story, because if they were, they wouldn't date it this late. Well, that to me is not based on textual evidence or manuscript evidence. That's really based on your presupposition against anything miraculous.
It's because you talked about if someone is lying on an account, they might try to sneak a detail in there.
Yes.
And I know part of the case for the Gospels being written early is one of the things is they don't mention the destruction of the temple, which we know happened in 70 AD. But I have heard atheists say, well, it actually, the New Testament does have the destruction of the temple in the form of Jesus predicting it. And so that they say that was a sneaky way for them to put in the destruction of the temple, but to try to make it more look like Jesus could predict it. How would you respond to that?
Well, no, I agree with you. But if you think about, and I see that, but for example, Luke, who writes 2 volumes, Luke and Acts, right? He's going to present these as one huge volume, 2 books in one huge volume. And he even says this to Theophilus in the beginning of the book of Acts and in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. So he introduces all of it in the Gospel of Luke. He introduces Theophilus as most excellent, and then when he refers to him again in the first chapter of Acts, he's less formal, and he says, "In my former book, I wrote to you." Now, it's interesting to me that in the one book, in the prelude, he basically, everyone knows that Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and that's the reason why I expect to see it in Acts. If you're going to sneak it in as a prediction and you're writing to somebody, I mean, they know it occurs, but why wouldn't you at least draw their attention to the fact that these predictions took place? These predictions actually occurred over here. But it's not just the one thing that's missing. It's not just the destruction of the temple. It's that there's lots of reasons for dispersions, lots of reasons for hardship of Christians in the first century. It is the siege of Jerusalem. It is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. None of this data is mentioned by Luke. Okay, maybe that's not his emphasis. Okay, fine. But how about this? He mentions key players, and several of these key players die in the 60s. Peter dies in the 60s, Paul dies in the 60s, and James, the brother of John, dies in the 60s. As a matter of fact, Barnabas dies in 61. So there you've got 4 key players that get a lot of ink in the gospel, in the book of Acts, none of whom are mentioned in terms of their death, even though someone like as inconsequential, an early death, and it's the only one we know for sure this early, is the death of James, the brother of John, right? There's an apostle who dies in 44. Well, that gets in there. Well, why would you put that? Well, because he's an apostle. Well, really, has he really said anything about the activity of James, the brother of John, that would warrant his mentioning his death? But he does mention it. Yet James, the brother of Jesus, whose activity is chronicled, foot by foot, nothing about his death. Nothing about Peter's death. As a matter of fact, the way these men die is compelling. And I think it would actually bolster the case that these folks died without flinching and without changing their story. Those are good data points to put in the gospel. If you didn't have any of it, just Paul. You're tracking along with Paul. Paul's your key story. Paul. He's in Rome. He's in custody in Rome. He's about to die in Rome. We know he dies around 63, 64. Yet you don't mention that. That could be the climactic final chapter in which Paul, your lead character, dies for the sake of the gospel. It's not there. And that to me was interesting. But it's not just that. It's not just the historical data related to Jerusalem that's missing. It's not just the deaths of those key players that's missing. It's also that this seems to be supported by internal evidence in the Gospels, at least in the letters of Paul, in both his letter to Timothy and, but more importantly, his letter to the Corinthian church, in which he seems to know the data that Luke is using in his gospel related to the Lord's Supper. And I've heard people say, well, come on, that's just that they're quoting some original source. My point is that what is more likely? Is it more likely? People sometimes will say, well, couldn't Luke be quoting Paul? Here's what I know. I know that the words that Luke uses in his gospel are being quoted to the Corinthian church as early as 53 AD. And Paul is, in essence, telling them, I taught you how to do the Lord's Supper. And now you people are getting drunk before the Lord's Supper. It's very inappropriate. Now, I'm going to remind you of what was passed on. And he recites this passage from Luke's gospel. And it's a pretty decent number of words that are copied out of Luke's gospel. And I'll tell you that even if this is not, he's citing something that was not written, perhaps he's just citing something that is part of the verbal transmission of the story of Jesus. I'm okay with that. Here's why I say that. There's oftentimes when I will meet, I'm working a cold case. Cold cases are just unsolved murders, and mine go back to about 1979 to about 1988-ish. So I'm always working these cases from the past. Let's say I have a case in 1980. A guy is a witness to the case, but nobody interviews him. Nobody. And then I discover by reopening the case, this guy exists, and I find him. He's now in Idaho. And I call him up and I say, hey, can you give me your statement? And he says, yeah, this is what happened. I'm like, wow, that's really that's powerful. We didn't have that back in 1980 when this occurred. Nobody found you. You didn't come forward. Well, I had to leave the area, and I just didn't think anybody was that important, so I just never contacted anybody. Okay, so now I have this critical piece of data, an account from 1980, but I didn't learn about it till 2019. Now I'm going to write the first report ever written about this eyewitness account. It's 2019. We're way behind the curve. We're 39 years behind the curve. So how do I know? Well, so I said to him, okay, do me a favor. Was there anybody else back in the day that you told this to? Yes. Okay. Don't before you can contact them, stay on the line with me. I want to call these people. And I get a hold of those people and I say, do you remember this guy back in 1980 saying anything about this? And he says, yeah. They say, yeah. And they basically repeat the story that he gave me. Well, now the fact that it was not recorded for 39 years, does it really matter to me? What matters is, was the eyewitness testimony available? Was there somebody there who was available to see this back in 1980? And I've now confirmed that. It does not matter that 39 years have gone by before it was written down. So when I look at those kinds of things, what I'm really trying to isolate is how early was this account of Jesus available? What form was it available? Don't care, because it's harder to tell the lie early than it is late. This is why when Paul in 1 Corinthians says that there are more than 500 of the brethren who saw Jesus at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. He's telling the people in that generation, 53, 54 AD, that there were still nearly 500 people alive they could interview. That's why that's so important. It's tougher, I think, to tell that lie in front of people who would know better, who would know if it was a lie. It's much easier to wait till everyone's dead and then just say whatever you want to say. Write this in the 2nd century. Who in the world would know if you're telling the truth? But if you're writing it and talking about it and presenting it as evidence as early as Paul is in 1 Corinthians, I'll tell you, 1 Corinthians 15 is a powerful piece of textual evidence. And even skeptics like a Bart Ehrman does not deny the Pauline authorship of 1 Corinthians and does not deny the early authorship of 1 Corinthians. He would put it in the early 50s. That's too early. That's 20 years after the resurrection. And how long have they been talking about this? He presents things to Timothy in the 60s. He describes them as scripture. I just think I always say, is it possible? Anything's possible, but I don't think it's reasonable that this is a late document. And I do think that we can date it using the missing elements that are in, because this got separated as a text, right? And so I think, honestly, if you're going to say predict that Jesus says that, and by the way, that's a lot of reasons. I was talking to Dan Wallace about this many years ago. Why do skeptics sometimes want to date the Gospels later? There's two ways to do that. One way would be to say, well, I've got textual evidence. I've got some piece of textual evidence, right? Manuscript evidence that would tell me when to date it. That is not what's causing them to date it late. What's causing them to date it late is that they see that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And because they have an anti-supernatural bias that says no one can predict that, it must have already happened. Therefore, they could put that in as though it's a prediction, And so they want to date it post 70 AD. So they're not looking at this interior evidence that we're looking at. They're not looking at all those things, missing elements. They're not looking at how early the Gospels are cited by Paul. They're not looking at about how early the first students of the eyewitnesses began to repeat the story, because if they were, they wouldn't date it this late. But instead, they're using what's dating it is that, number one, they don't think anything supernatural ever happens. So these must have been written after the destruction of the temple, and they must have been written after anyone who was an eyewitness was dead, because they contain all these miracle accounts. We know those can't happen because miracles don't happen. Therefore, they've got to be written late so that nobody would catch that. Nobody would know. Well, that to me is not based on textual evidence or manuscript evidence. That's really based on your presupposition against anything miraculous.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I noticed that in my conversations, they'll take one piece of evidence out and think that they can refute that and that busts the whole case. But it's really a cumulative case.
Oh.
Maybe one piece doesn't stand alone, but there's so many pieces to it.
I can tell you that what you just said is really powerful, because a lot of my approach to this is kind of born in my experience in criminal trials. So every criminal trial we do on a cold case, remember, cold cases were unsolved back then. Well, the reason why they were unsolved back then, they were lame, okay? We didn't have good evidence. We didn't have a lot of stuff that we would typically want to make a case. So the DA looked at it and said, they've got nothing here, bud. We're not filing this. So they didn't file it. So now we come at it years later. It's not like we have fingerprint evidence or DNA. There are some times when DNA, especially now, by the way, ancestry DNA is doing wonders for the law enforcement community, right? But we just didn't have that. And a lot of times these weren't protected because there was no DNA mindset back in 1979. So some of these things weren't even sampled. And then when they were contaminated. So it's a mess. Now, what's interesting about that is that we know that when we build these cases in front of the jury, they are cumulative cases. I call these death by 1,000 paper cuts for a reason. Each little piece feels like it's kind of, really? If that's all you had, nobody would ever convict this guy. But it's because you have 80 of these, paper cuts that surround the suspect that you really have a good inference. And you could say, well, is it possible that there's just 80 stellar coincidences in which these 80 planets were perfectly aligned? Well, yeah, that's possible. But the more reasonable explanation is he's just guilty and responsible. He is the one common causal factor that unifies all of these paper cuts. Okay, mm-hmm. And so what defense attorneys always do, and we tell in our close, as a matter of fact, we have a presentation that's part of our rebuttal. Mm-hmm. In every single trial, we use it over and over and over again, because every single defense attorney in his closing argument does that. He takes out each piece and tries to get rid of it. In other words, he tries to explain it away some other way. And we tell people, there's danger in not seeing the forest, for the trees, because you basically he wants you to focus on that little tree mm-hmm. and miss the forest. And so again, the only way to infer on that is to say, well, yeah, it's just an amazing coincidence that the temple's not mentioned, that the destruction of Jerusalem's not mentioned, that the death of Peter's not mentioned, and Paul's not mentioned, and James is not mentioned, and Barnabas is not mentioned, and by coincidence they happen to mention Stephen and James, the brother of John, who are very minor players compared to the other four. And it's just a coincidence that he happens to mention this to Timothy. He happens to quote Luke's gospel and call it scripture. It's just a coincidence that he mentions to the Corinthians. Yeah, it could be. It could be that this is all just individual stuff that doesn't really have any connectivity at all. But that's not reasonable. And I try to illustrate it. If your kid is a teenager and he comes home one night and goes right to bed and you don't get to talk to him, and the next morning you get up and you see that his car is parked kind of away from the curb. It's like kind of crooked and like 3 feet away from the curb on one side. And you walk over to the car and you look on the floor, on the ground next to the driver's door, and you see a little receipt and it's all crumpled up, and you open it up. It's to a liquor store for a fifth of vodka. And you go, really? What's that about? Right? And then he stumbles out of bed 3 hours late, and he's still got the clothes he was in last night, and he smells like alcohol, right? And he's got a headache, yeah. It's possible that all of these things are unrelated, but what you're going to do in your mind as a parent is you're going to put together all the paper cuts, and you're going to go, dude, what were you doing last night? I would hope you would. That's your common sense assembling the circumstantial cumulative case. And we do this all the time. That's all we're doing here is we're assembling a cumulative case. And my expectation is always the defense attorneys go after the pieces and try to make sure you don't see the forest. They want to just take a look at each tree, get hung up, get so close to that tree that you can't back up and see the forest. And that's what they always do. And because that's so consistent, we get a chance, we do our closing argument, then the defense does their closing argument, and because we have the burden of proof, we do a rebuttal. They don't get a chance to answer our rebuttal, okay? Because we have the burden, so we get two chances. One, to close, he closes, and then we rebut his closing. And because we know this is what he's going to do in the closing, our rebuttal already has that part assembled. Don't get caught up in his attempt to make you see the tree only and miss the whole forest. Back up and see the entire body of evidence. So the same thing is true for us when we're talking to people who would like to kind of drill down on one paper cut piece of evidence and try to get rid of it. Well, fine. Good luck with that. It's not a case built on one piece. It's the case built cumulatively.